This is an addendum to my explanation of how to interpret the output from this predictor with three levels. And remember I said that for the performance outcome, there was a violation of the Levene's assumption, the homogeneity assumption via the Levene's test. And so I wanted to show you, I did not scroll down enough in my R Markdown document. And so you probably already noticed this, that there's this note, the homogeneity of variances was violated, and so I had forgotten that I'd run a Welch's ANOVA, which is robust to the matter of violation of that assumption, and the results were no different. Now, the effect size is the same, so it didn't get larger. The significance is about the same. So this is why a lot of people, I think, say that this homogeneity assumption doesn't usually change the results, meaning that the regular ANOVA test is usually just fine even when this assumption is violated. But I don't want to assume that. So every time that this assumption is violated, I would just run the test that corrects for that, which is Welch's, and this is just a base R one-way.test command where you're putting in the DV and then department and then the data set. And then equal var.equal is false. So what you're doing is telling it to assume that there's not equal variance. And a lot of times people will just run the Welch's from the beginning and just assume that it's not the case, like that this assumption is violated right at the front. And that is an option that people have. Just make sure that you report it. Report it that way. What I do is I generally I run the Levene's test, and if it's not violated, I just report the normal ANOVA, not the Welch's. But of course, if there's a violation, then look at the Welch's, and if the results don't differ at all, then that is up to the reviewer, I think. So you'll say that the assumption was violated, and so we ran the Welch's correction, and the results were no different. Here are the results. Or some people just report the regular one and not worry about that assumption being violated. Like I've said before, when I read research and I see it presented at conferences, I hardly ever hear anybody talking about assumptions being violated, and if they were, did they run the correction, and did it yield the same results or similar results? Did it yield results that were somewhat different, and if so, they went with the corrected version? Like, that level of detail is, if you do that, you're, I think, way ahead of the game of how it's done currently, like the current status quo, and that's not a bad thing. I think it's a good thing to let your audience know. We've talked about this before, that there are time limits both on presentations, and there's and there's space limits in journals, and so there's just not a lot of space and time to belabor all of the different assumptions that you tested and which ones are violated and what you did about them. And although that's the ideal, in presentations people start to nod off when you do that. It's very technical, and your clients may not care at all when you're working in industry. So it's up to you and your judgment, to look at the correction. If it's wildly different, then just present the correction as if don't even talk about violating the assumption in front of clients who don't understand the tech side. And then for journals, I think it's a little bit less clear as to how to handle it, because it's just not typically done. There's not the space and all that. So anyway, but JAR standards tells us to do this. And so being the good scientists that we are, I'm sharing with you how to do it, all the thinking around it, what's done typically versus what should be done maybe, what's the ideal situation. And so now you have all the information. All right. So because the results didn't differ wildly, significantly, I don't think, from the regular one-way ANOVA and that we typically do, I just carried on as normal with the regression analysis, and knowing that I have confidence that the results are are accurate because the correction did not produce a result that was different at all. It was like an F of 17 something versus 16.5 something. That is not different enough for me, and this p-value did not change very much at all either. All right, so anyway, addendum to the very long screencast that came prior. I just wanted you to have the full context of what to do when the Levene's test comes out significant.